In this series of videos, we'll look at the coming of the American Civil War, focusing on the 1850s. Certainly driving a lot of the events was the growth of the abolitionist movement. And in this first video here, we're going to focus on who the abolitionists were. Abolitionism, in the most general sense, the belief that slavery should be abolished everywhere in the United States, had its roots in colonial America. Slavery existed in all the original 13 colonies. Looking at the picture here, you can see each colony's number of slaves and that percentage of the population in 1770. So every state had slaves. Abolitionism first grew in the northern colonies, not surprisingly, in part due to the religious nature of these colonies' founding, but also because slavery was not as integral to their economies. In fact, the first group to come out for the abolition of slavery were the Quakers, and they actually came out as early as the late 17th century. In 1688, they wrote the so-called Germantown Quaker Petition against slavery. It was an unusually early and forceful condemnation of slavery. In 1775, the Quakers in Pennsylvania formed the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage and began to coordinate their efforts politically for abolitionism. The growth of the Enlightenment in the years before the Revolution, and of course the revolutionary rhetoric itself, which reflected the Enlightenment, added momentum to the growth of abolitionism in the North. By 1804, all the new northern states had voted to abolish the institution of slavery within their borders. In many of these states, however, the abolition was not immediate. Instead, gradual emancipation laws set deadlines by which all slaves would be freed, releasing individuals as they reached a certain age or the end of a certain work period. This situation left some African Americans lingering in bondage servitude. Shown here is a painting from the 1790s showing Lady Liberty with an American eagle. In the early 1800s, Great Britain outlawed the African slave trade, and a few years later in the 1830s outlawed slavery in their country and their colonies. Other European countries soon followed, such as France. This all added momentum to American abolitionism. Many Americans easily recognized the hypocrisy between its stated principles of democracy and equal rights on the one hand, and the institution of slavery on the other. I mean, it was for many Americans just a national embarrassment. Shown here is a history of the British Parliament's efforts to get rid of the African slave trade. It's a contemporaneous history. By the antebellum period, with Manifest Destiny driving America westward, the question of whether slavery should extend into the western territories and ultimately into any new states, that sort of was becoming the burning question. Many Northerners believed that while slavery was ugly and maybe a national embarrassment, it was not possible to eradicate it where it already existed, namely in the South. To do so would lead to a war that would destroy the United States. They could, however, they believe, contain slavery, keep it from spreading westward. Moreover, in the antebellum age, most people, even in the North, didn't believe that African Americans were equal to whites. A majority in the North may have been against slavery as an institution and recognized the humanity in the black population, but this did not necessarily mean that they believed that African Americans were physically or intellectually the same, or that they should have equal political, social, and economic rights under the law with whites. Undoubtedly, the emergence of Darwinism in the 1850s underscored the perception that blacks were from the same proverbial tree as whites, but had not advanced through natural selection to the same degree. For the literate, Darwinism gave an intellectual foundation for the differences in race. Shown here, you can see a picture of Charles Darwin and one of his seminal work, The Origin of Species. A minority in the North, however, saw slavery as so inherently sinful, the United States would never win God's approval, allowing it to continue anywhere, including in the South. They wanted to end it immediately, without delay, and throughout all of the United States. By the antebellum age, these individuals were known as the abolitionists. They were a distinct minority in the North, perceived as radical, even dangerous by the Northern majority. Many abolitionists, if not most, went so far as to argue that African Americans were in fact totally equal to whites in all aspects of life, and that they should be citizens with full and equal rights. Religion was obviously the most powerful motive for abolitionists. The most ardent abolitionists tended to be the most devout. Certainly the Second Great Awakening's revivalism and its stressing of equality of souls contributed to the abolitionist sentiment. But, the abolitionists would argue that the overall crux of Jesus' teachings was love and brotherhood, treating each other kindly as God's creation. And they noted that Jesus embraced the poor and outcast in society. They also argued that slavery hurt the slave owners themselves. Man, there would be hell to pay, literally, on Judgment Day. Slaveholders would have to account for all their sins. They noted that slavery led to many unchristian behaviors, such as making slave females bed warmers and so forth. And so a major driving force of the abolitionists was a religious sentiment that this was just sinful and wrong. It's interesting to look at how the abolitionist movement kind of overlapped with other reform movements of the same period that kind of grew out of the Second Great Awakening and also had religious motives. Things like temperance and prison reform and women's rights. Many of these reformers saw the abolitionist movement as part and parcel of the same type of direction America should go. The women's rights activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, said that they should all work together. Now, others, however, feared that allying with abolitionists would either water down their movement or make it appear too radical, and they would lose converts. And so they tried to distance themselves from the abolitionist movement, because it was seen, again, so radical. Not only were the most devout religious people often abolitionists, but the free black population was another driving force in the movement during the antebellum age, not surprisingly, because they're African American. One of the earliest to free blacks to advocate for abolitionism was a man named Richard Allen, who in the late colonial and early national period argued against slavery. He is famous for creating the African Methodist Episcopal Church, often called the AME Church. And in 1830, he hosted a free black Negro convention, sort of to get his AME ministers involved in the abolitionist movement. About the same time that Richard Allen was forming his Negro convention and trying to get AME ministers to support abolitionism, you see two free blacks, John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish, begin to publish the first black newspaper known as the Freedom's Journal, which obviously advocated for abolitionism. Here you can see a copy of Freedom's Journal. Not surprisingly, it was hard to get the magazine out, as whites tended to try to shut it down. They would confiscate copies they found and so forth. So it was kind of an underground paper type of thing. Of the very early free black abolitionists, probably the most famous one was David Walker. He was a free black originally from North Carolina who made a living selling sort of secondhand clothes. And he wasn't a minister, but his speeches and his writings, they sounded like sermons, and he used a lot of religious rhetoric. He argued that people had a sacred duty to eradicate the evils of slavery. You can see him here in a picture of him as an old man, but early on he was, of course, in the turn of the 19th century, when he was active that early, he was a much younger man. In 1829, Walker published a book called Appeal to the Colored Citizens. which sort of ridiculed slave owners and justified a slave rebellion. Now, that is serious stuff, sure to get a lot of people angry at you. The book declared to whites, quote, "We must and we shall be free in spite of you, and woe will be to you if we have to obtain our freedom by fighting," unquote. The book went through 3 printings. Well, the whites obviously tried to confiscate it. They even tried to smuggle copies into slaves in the South. Walker later on began the call for a national convention for free blacks and abolitionists in Philadelphia in 1830. It proved quite a successful convention. It drew hundreds and a lot of media attention and quickly became an annual event. Unfortunately, Walker didn't live too long to see much of that continuing success, as maybe sadly, not surprisingly, he vanished under mysterious circumstances. Although there was no prosecution, he was, of course, most likely lynched. One free black woman became famous as an abolitionist, Sojourner Truth. She was born Isabella Baumfree in a New York Dutch community and spoke not only English but also Dutch. She was a slave and treated harshly before New York ended slavery, and that therefore she was a free black that advocated for abolitionism. She was influenced by the Second Great Awakening, and she changed her name to Sojourner Truth and began preaching that God condemned slavery. She was a tremendous public speaker and became famous enough to actually later on meet Abraham Lincoln. Another free black, Daniel Payne, who, like Richard Allen, was a bishop in the AME Church, helped found Wilberforce University in Ohio, which was the first college for African Americans in the United States. He founded it right before the Civil War broke out. It was named for William Wilberforce, the British politician whose deep religious faith led him to fight the British slave trade very early in the late 19th century. Perhaps the most famous of the free black abolitionists was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland, but escaped to Massachusetts in 1838 and began lecturing with William Lloyd Garrison, who I'll talk about in a second, a white minister who was an abolitionist. In 1847, he bought his freedom from his former master, and thus assured that he could not be arrested as a fugitive and returned to slavery. He remained an ally and friend with Garrison, but he's always wary to keep his independence from any white abolitionist domination of the movement. He was a gifted writer and speaker throughout the North. He joined the AME Church and became an AME preacher and even led a Sunday school class. He visited Great Britain and pushed for all the British leaders not to help their American counterparts who practiced slavery. And he called for American ministers of all faiths to join the abolitionist movement. Slavery for him was a clear sin. Douglass was very, very harsh on churches or religions that defended slavery. Quote, "Let the religious press, the pulpit, the Sunday school, the conference meeting, the great ecclesiastical missionary Bible and tract associations of the land array their immense powers against slavery," unquote. He founded a famous abolitionist newspaper called the North Star, whose motto was in part, "God is the Father of us all and we are all brethren." It was always an Old Testament God to Douglass, who noted that prouder and stronger governments than America's have been shattered by the bolts of wrath of a just God. The North Star, again, was something that they tried to get into the South, but was blocked. During the Civil War, Douglass helped recruit black soldiers for the Union cause, and after the war, he promoted federal civil rights legislation during the Reconstruction era. While the free black population was a driving force of abolitionism, its reach was limited because they were African American. When you have white ministers get involved in it, of course, it attracted a lot more attention. So, turning our attention to some of the the most powerful white abolitionists, you got to start with Theodore Dwight Weld. He was a son of a minister, and he became a minister himself. Weld taught at Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio, and was known for his fiery anti-slavery rhetoric. His followers at Lane founded an anti-slavery society there, and they became known as the Lane Rebels, and you can see a picture of them here. In 1837, he published a book, The Bible Against Slavery, in which he outlined a theological argument against the institution. Keep in mind that many people interpret the Bible to endorse slavery. I'll talk a little more about that in a subsequent video. 2 years later, in 1839, he followed with another book, American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. It amounted to a bunch of stories from slaves themselves, kind of like an oral history. Weld intended to counter the argument that slavery was paternalistic and protected blacks. It wasn't an attempt to be an accurate historical account, but he got together some of the horror stories that they told. One of Weld's white abolitionist colleagues, and probably the most famous of the white abolitionist colleagues, was William Lloyd Garrison. He was a Massachusetts-born printer who had just put in jail in the 1830s for libeling a New York merchant involved in the slave trade. He was really denounced the idea of the civil religion of the fathers, the idea that America it had a general moral principles, but none of the specifics of individual denominations. This idea of a civil religion he didn't like because he said it removed a lot of the sin from the Bible, and so he's going to be quite harsh in his rhetoric and has become famous or infamous depending on your point of view at the time. He published in 1831 a weekly journal entitled The Liberator, and it deplored all calls for gradual emancipation of slavery or waiting for it to die out. It had to be eradicated now. He even denounced the Constitution because it sort of endorsed slavery with its 3/5 compromise and with the continuation of the slave trade for 20 years. He called the Constitution a covenant with death, an agreement with hell. He even burned publicly a copy of the Constitution. So you can see he is no wonder he's famous or infamous. Garrison famously said, "I will be as harsh as truth and uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Again, he is a true believer. He really was so radical that he began to use free blacks as bodyguards as he moved around because so many people were threatened to kill him. Garrison was probably important because he helped attract some of the transcendentalist writers like Emerson and to the abolitionist cause, and the transcendentalist movement is going to become another driving force for abolitionism. Weld and Garrison soon joined forces and famously formed the American Anti-Slavery Society. It was helped because it had several financial contributors that kept it solvent in its controversial existence. It had two main tactics. It would pressure legislatures with petitions and then try to mobilize public opinion. In 1838, for example, it got 500,000 signatures on a petition to outlaw slavery, and that's pretty impressive for 1838. They would travel around and use what mass communications they existed there, and that meant with better printing presses, they could get their message out easier. And in 1839 alone, they published 100,000 pieces of anti-slavery pamphlets. In 1835, in July 1835, abolitionists mailed more than 175,000 items through the New York City Post Office alone. This concludes the first video on the beginnings and growth of the American abolitionist movement.